Gender-responsive sustainable finance is very much in line with empowering women, as it is both credible and accountable alignment of financial flows with environmental and gender equality goals towards inclusive economies. Finally, some housekeeping. Please engage and use the Q&A to give us your comments, but also your questions. After the webinar, we would really appreciate if you could complete our short survey. And lastly, a full recording of the webinar will be available on the Green Finance platform and on the GGKP Gender Expert Working Group. We also encourage you to continue the discussion on the GGKP Green Forum. And with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator for today's event, Ingvild Solvang, who's the head of Climate Action and Inclusive Development Unit with the Global Green Growth Institute in Seoul. She has nearly 20 years of experience working in international development and humanitarian affairs. Based in South Asia for nearly 2 decades, she has responded to emergency while also managing development programs for various organizations worldwide, always with a focus on poverty reduction, gender equality, and social inclusion. Prior to joining GDGI headquarters in Seoul, Ingvild was the global lead for entrepreneurship with CARES, Women's Economic Empowerment Team. Ingvild is also, and most importantly here, the co-chair of the recently established GGKP Gender Expert Group, which is supporting this webinar. And the Gender Expert Group is aimed to catalyze evidence-based policy, development processes, and collective action towards gender equality and women's empowerment in transition to a green and low carbon economy. So Ingvild, I would like to thank you very much for all your cooperation towards this webinar, and I'll now give you the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Camille, for that great introduction. And also welcome to all panelists and participants, and thank you for joining today. As Camille mentioned, I am with the Global Green Growth Institute. I actually very recently relocated to Europe from Seoul, Korea. And I'm also the co-chair of the GGKP Gender Expert Group, which is a group of leading and like-minded green growth and green economy institutions, all of us GGKP partners, working to identify and fill knowledge gaps on gender in just transitions, and to explore how a collaboration between us institutions could maximize the support that we provide for low-emission, green and inclusive economic transitions globally. And for more information on the Gender Expert Group, you may visit the GGKP Green Forum or reach out to us for more information. And now to today's discussion. It is with great pleasure that I will introduce the topic and also a rock-solid panel of experience and expertise that can help us explore today's key question. How do we leverage gender-responsive sustainable finance to build inclusive market economies that ensure human rights and justice for all, as well as effective climate action and sustainable development? Now, the matter is a mouthful and the matter is complex, and I would say that the ability of our financial markets to leverage sustainable development at scale is an urgent concern as we are racing to face the multiple planetary crises of climate change, loss of biodiversity and natural habitats, desertification, air pollution, and waste, along with our many socioeconomic and human development challenges. Gender equality and women's empowerment is central to the question of sustainable finance, because closing the gender gap in societies and economies is a matter of human rights and justice. And we do believe that sustainable finance and green transitions are an opportunity to achieve greater gender equality if done right. But we can also take a more instrumental view that without the full participation of women, men, boys and girls of all creeds, we will not be able to meet the sustainability challenges that we are faced with. We need all hands on deck, with women also as workers, professionals and business owners, civil society organizers, consumers, decision makers and leaders. And within both these perspectives, we find the business case for gender equality that must and should preoccupy policymakers, financial institutions, and investors as we move towards aligning financial systems with sustainable development goals at all levels. This means bringing gender transformative sustainable finance from the margin to the mainstream of our financial systems. Now, there I said it, and it's easy to say it, but now let's focus on how it can be done. How do we measure and scale gender-responsive outcomes of sustainable finance? How can we unlock sustainable finance for financial and economic inclusion? And what do financial products that integrate gender and inclusivity actually look like? And how do we catalyze gender equality-focused market economies? So let's focus on ambition and transformative impacts at scale. And now to the 5 panelists with the answers today. And let me start by introducing Nina Kolibashkina, who is the Senior Social Development Specialist of the Climate Investment Fund. She has 20 years of experience, and she works on mainstreaming gender and spearheading a wider social inclusion agenda through policy and technical assistance, analytical working capacity within the Climate Investment Fund. We also have Marcos Neto, who is the director of UNDP Finance Sector Hub, a role he has held since 2019, and when the hub was established. But already since 2013, he has led UNDP's global work on private sector development and foundations, which has included leadership on the UNDP private sector strategy and its offers on Sustainable Development Goal SDG finance. We also have Denise Odaro with us, who is the head of investor relations at International Finance Corporation, IFC. She has been with the IFC since 2012, and she is also the executive chair of ICMA's Green Bonds Principles. And she's among the authors of the Bond to Bridge the Gender Gap Guide, which was published by the IFC in 2021. So welcome, Denise. We also have Barbara Rambusek, who is the Director of Gender and Economic Inclusion at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, from where she leads the bank's projects and policy programs on economic inclusion across all sectors and regions of operation. Thank you for joining, Barbara. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Mamiko Yokoi Arai, who is Deputy Head of Financial Markets Division and Head of the Infrastructure and Alternative Financing Unit at the OECD. She leads insurance work as well as key financial market issues and coordinates the OECD's Insurance and Private Pensions Committee, which has brought her into contact with ESG investment, disaster risk financing, and much more. So thank you all to the panelists. It's a great honor to be with you here today. So just a little bit about how we are planning to structure the conversation. We will do a couple of rounds of questions to the panelists before we open up the floor to the audience for questions and comments that you may have, and please feel free to send them through as the panelists are speaking, and then we hope to address some of them when we come to the next stage of the conversation. So let's get started. And now I would like to start with you, Marcos. Perhaps you could help us further set the scene a little bit. Now we know, and I think UNDP is very well placed to speak to this, with reference to the large finance gap for the achievement of SDGs, NDCs, and other financial gaps in terms of sustainability. What is the role of what we call sustainable finance, specifically gender-responsive sustainable finance, in closing this gap? And what do you see are the main barriers towards unblocking gender-responsive sustainable finance at scale?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Delighted to be in the context of the CSW, the only male participant in this panel. So that's very important. Listen, in your question, I think the first point is, what is this gap to finance sustainable development and the NDCs, right? We even see, and my colleagues at OECD have, we did a joint work on SDG aligning framework for financing, and we actually see with the COVID an increase in the gap, right? Around $5 trillion now. But the truth is, we have to look at this gap not as a quantum. There has never been so much money in the world, so much liquidity in corporations, so much investment. So the problem here is not that we don't have the money. As a matter of fact, that despite COVID, according to Credit Suisse, global wealth has increased and is now north of $400 trillion, all types of wealth, right? So the problem is not lack of money. The problem is an alignment, right? Where the resources, both public and private, flow to, both in terms of the qualitative natures of sustainable finance, so it's flowing towards sustainability, flowing towards those aspects, but also flowing geographically, right? To places that need us the most, because let's be honest, right? $1 investment of sustainable finance, and women's own enterprises in Sweden is not the same as $1 in Zambia. That $1 in Zambia is going to go a long way more than the one in Sweden, right? So we need this alignment to be qualitative as well as geographical. And I think Denise here from the IFC understands that better than anyone else on the IFC work around the developing world, right? So for us, it is very important that we understand that this is not a lack of money in the world. Second is COVID has exacerbated structural problems vis-a-vis financing, gender equality and women in aspects like that. Having said that, we also know, and you were talking about, I would add to what you said at the opening, that it's actually a damn good return on investment, right, to invest on women. We know, for example, that if we were to achieve gender parity, equal labor force, the global economy would see an increase by $28 trillion just by fulfilling, SDG 5, but we also know that women own enterprises, 30% of all enterprises in the world, but only gets 10% of capital, right? Those are structural problems. They were exacerbated with COVID, but they were there before, and they're going to be there after. And we really need to address that. I do think that sustainable finance, both from the public and the private capital, are important, right? And part of the starting to answer the how, we at UNDP are working with 71 governments around the world in designing financing strategies for them. So they've got the SDG plans, they got the NDCs, but they don't know how much it costs. They don't know exactly what is the best financing strategy. And one of the things we're trying to do as we are supporting the governments with the IMF and the European Union and the World Bank in some countries is to get them to understand the need for policies that drive an enabling environment and drive capital to women. I'm delighted to see that a lot of those financial strategies that are being developed in final phase of developing these now are putting women and women's finance as a priority. And I think that's an important element of that. So I think the policy side, all the way from the G20, as we are now, I had the secretary of the Sustainable Finance Working Group at the G20, we are looking at a transition framework. And I do think the social aspects and the aspects of women empowerment and parity are very important. And policy all the way down from the G20 to national are very important. My final opening comment is, as instruments is also very important. We at UNDP are working with around 30 governments on thematic debt instruments, green bonds, SDG bonds. And I do think with our colleagues from UN Women, we are talking about an orange bonds. And there are countries like Mexico and others that are very interesting, to explore instruments that are women's focus. Now, it is important that two things. One, we take into consideration when you're talking about instruments, sovereign instruments, on a growing debt crisis that we're starting to see. How do we balance and manage this so countries cannot be hampering their development in function of a debt crisis. And second, the affordability for those instruments, right? This is something that we are actually very, very concerned at the G20 level is, you know, the market is buying those instruments. Whatever you put out there on SDG, green bond, the market is buying and it's oversubscribed. We saw that with Indonesia, with Mexico. But when it came down to help the government of Uzbekistan, the coupon was very expensive, right? So we do need to figure out a way not only to see more of those thematic debt instruments, more of they directed to women specifically, but find the right affordability, right? The right equation between risk for those instruments so governments and sovereigns can actually issue those in the market. I'll stop for here now, and I know there will be a second round to come back.
Great, thank you so much, Marcos, for kickstarting the conversation. And you made a shout out to Denise for good reason. And I think continuing on what you already started on talking about thematic bonds, and I'm not surprised that you bring that up, because I certainly see that also in the work of GGGI at the moment, that this is really, it has been a growing market for some time. It continues to grow as an opportunity. So I would like to turn to you, Denise. I know also you have another commitment, so you might have to leave us a little bit early today. Now, if we look at the bonds markets, and based on the long-standing work that you have done in working on sort of how to integrate gender into thematic bonds, what trends are you currently seeing in terms of gender in the bonds market? What barriers and opportunities do you see for really moving the needle on gender equality through instruments such as sustainable bonds?
Thank you so much, Ingvilde. Let me start off by thanking you again for having me here. It's such a topical subject matter, of course, and aptly timed given it is Women's History Month in many countries around the world. And huge thanks to yourself, to Ryan and Camille for putting this together. So to start off, I think, just building on what Marcus just so very eloquently put, it is very important to stress a few things. And the first one that I think is worth pondering is the role that the debt market plays. It plays a huge role in shaping economies, as we know, impacting business, and even our daily decisions. And the second is that within the capital markets, the bond market is king. It is at least 1.3 times the size of the stock markets, even in developed markets, and more so in certain countries, in fact. So when we talk about financing gaps, which you very well put earlier, or development goals, I mean, we're halfway to, you know, hopefully meeting the SDGs. It is impossible to do so without engaging the bond market. And so with that, I think when you consider that, and then in parallel, that what I refer to as the gender agenda, what we are discussing now, it once fell, I mean, quite candidly, under AOB, any other business, you know, peripheral discussion. But now gender inequality is front and center of global business debates, which is good news for all of us here on this panel and yourself. You know, we were once working in this sort of niche area, and now we're no longer, you know, prophets wearing socks and sandals yelling into the wilderness. Everyone's actually having this conversation. But how is this playing out then as a theme within the bond market? And Marcus has mentioned this, the rise of sustainable finance, you know, debt instruments. You've got social sustainability-linked bonds and loans. These are providing opportunities for market participants that want to advance gender equality by directing capital at scale to reducing the gender gap, right? So the demand for these products remains incredibly high. I mean, one hat I wear is head of investor relations, and I can certainly tell you I've yet to meet an investor in my entire career who said, I don't really care about that. So the demand is there. Supply has always been the issue. Now, we agree that these products, not only are they, you know, capable of shifting capital at scale, they're also impacting other asset classes. So you see sort of the developments within the bond markets. We've seen that sort of affect the loan market, and we're seeing seeds of that within even the derivatives world now, and, you know, private equity, etc. So there is a lot of scope here. Well, we talked about how the market has grown significantly, but gender-focused bonds remain relatively rare, even as sustainable debt market grows at a record pace. So as an example, I think there's been over 300 billion last year of debt sales linked to sustainability performance indicators around sort of female staff, etc. No, sorry, I mean globally, but then 10% of that has been linked towards gender, I meant to say. So 300 billion, and you've only got around 30 to 35 billion that's been linked to gender. And looking at that in terms of number, there's also around less than 80 bonds, in fact, that have come to market since 2013 that are focused on gender. Sad, because this continues to be the case in spite of, as Marco said, the COVID pandemic has disproportionately, of course, impacted women, and this gap continues to increase. So what we are sitting here looking at is, how is it so that investors, with all this money that we just talked about, want this, but on the supply side, there is this constraint. So I think from the conversations that I've had, the will continues to be there, but there's this huge education gap as to how to genuinely integrate gender into funding products and investment products, particularly within the corporates in the real sector. And I'd love to talk more about that later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that. Now, it sounds like we still need the socks and the sandals a little bit, like you, given this low focus on gender in the bonds market. Now, moving to Nina from the Climate Investment Fund, I think you have a unique insight into sort of the gender mechanisms within the MDBs, I think the MDBs have done quite a lot of the groundwork over the last decades to build gender, ESG and gender specifically, into the impact measurement frameworks that we need. So I was wondering whether we could sort of go to a little bit of the nuts and the bolts of this, and if you could share with us what you see as current trends and challenges for finance at scale when we look at it from sort of that impact perspective, and how we are defining criteria for gender responsiveness and how we measure ambitious impact for gender equality.
Thank you so much, Ingold. It is indeed a great pleasure to be on such an amazing panel with a number of partner organizations and dedicated to this very important topic. At Climate Investment Funds, we are indeed very privileged to be working with 6 excellent multilateral development banks. IFC and EBRD are among the panelists here that do carry out very innovative work on the nexus of gender equality and climate finance. All of those MDBs that we work with have their gender strategies. A number of them have updated them as recently as last year. IDB is just about to publish their strategy this month. And in those strategies specifically, there is a focus on sustainable finance, on climate action, and also in the climate change and sustainable finance strategies of the MDBs, there is also a focus on gender. So as you've mentioned, Ingold, in the last decade, a lot of work has taken place, and you can observe how MDBs have traveled the path from gender neutral, like making sure that the projects at least don't do harm, because a decade ago we could look at some investment and come up with those stories, to then traveling to gender responsive, making sure that within the projects the integration of gender components is really becoming well taken into consideration, to starting look at gender transformative. What do we need to start changing systems and norms in the society and legal frameworks in order to ensure that women proper participation both in the public governance of sustainable finance, but also from the market perspective. And I think what does it mean in practice? In SIF, we use a mechanism that we call gender scorecards. So at all the investment projects that come, and when we talk about finance, it is indeed a large amount of funding. To date, SIF has invested over $8 billion, and for each dollar invested, we mobilize up to $9 in co-financing. So it is quite significant resources. And how can we make sure that these resources serve women and serve other underprivileged groups and really bring them to the front and center of the debate? In practice, one of the tools we use is this gender scorecard that I mentioned, where we, at the beginning, at the project design stage, will look at the analysis, ensuring that there is proper gender analysis, that there are activities that are targeting women specifically, and then that there are indicators. Historically, if we look at the portfolio a few years back, often there was, analysis talked about one thing, and then there were some activities and then indicators not necessarily related to that. Recently, we're really tightening those requirements, and also introducing a requirement at project design that budget is also allocated for gender activities. That has also been a problem, that we talk and we set some ambition, but without putting specific funding for implementation of those activities, it does not necessarily happen. Then on procedural levels, there are also issues related to consultations with women groups and women organizations very extensively, both at the level of SIF, at the dialogue that we have with partnerships, but also at the project. And it is an explicit requirement during our investment plan preparation at the country level that women organizations are consulted. And going forward, we're looking at ways to institutionalize it even more. One of the issues is also monitoring, and on that I would say, it is still an uphill battle. And even now, looking at our portfolio, although there has been a lot of effort, only 50% of projects are complying with those three criteria that I've mentioned. So there is still quite a bit of work to do. And so far, the focus has been the second phase of the approach, this gender responsive approach, focused a lot on the individual outcomes of women. So what do we do that through projects women really benefit? There were various really great examples, activities on in improving access to services for women through projects, whether it's agricultural services or it's, for example, our projects in Vietnam and the Philippines focusing on mass rapid transit, how to make sure that the needs of women as the users of that service are properly incorporated. We have amazing experience working with EBRD in Tajikistan on developing the access to finance and credit lines that really take into consideration the needs of women as consumers. And increasingly, the emphasis is starting to shift from those individual outcomes of women, improving their asset position, improving their access to markets, to finance, to services, and to skills, to looking at systems. One of the proudest examples on that is the work of DGM, a mechanism where direct grants are provided to indigenous people, and there is a mechanism where they participate in the governance and decision making about those grants, and over 40% of those grants go to women-led organizations and to the groups where women are taking active part in decision making. Thank you.
That is excellent, Nina, and we will come back to you in a minute to hear a little bit more about some of the ambitious examples that you've seen. Now, I want to return right back to Denise again, and just making sure that we get as much as we can from Denise before she has to leave us today. Now, I think what Nina talks about is a bit the nuts and the bolts and how it's actually done. And I know that you and IFC, as I mentioned before, you have developed a very useful guide for gender in bonds for targeted at issuers, I believe. So I would want to you again to have you talk a little bit about sort of what tools work, what do we have now that could bring the educational component that you talked about earlier to really up that very, let me say, rather sad percentage of bonds currently that are taking gender into consideration. So please, Denise.
With pleasure. I think it's worth noting that this gap, it comes from the silos that we've all kind of been accustomed to in the way the businesses are structured. Even within development institutions, you've had finance, gender experts and the finance people never really speaking to each other. So talking to the same audience all the time. And now what we're trying to do is get both to speak. And I think that we are progressing with that. I mentioned that of the percentage that we've seen of sustainable bonds which make up gender, that's really come out of financial institutions and development institutions. So what you tend to find is that the proceeds from those bonds go to financing, access, loans for female entrepreneurs or women-run businesses, depending on the definitions. And pretty much that's what predominantly these proceeds are. So there is this huge gap because, of course, besides financial institutions, you have the entire real sector where this is still, again, on the fringes of conversations. So what we've sought to do is to bring clarity to how the bond market can be used to advance gender equality, particularly focusing on the real sector, seeing that we've already had momentum in the financial institutions. So alongside UN Women and the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, so we've put this guide together and it's called Bonds to Bridge the Gap. And I might put the link in the chat when I'm done, just to make sure that people can get to see it. It is very much a practical guide. And the idea of that was to make it easy and accessible to all kinds of market participants. I want to stress, so it's based on existing frameworks. It's not talking about creating a new label, a new, product. We understand that, of course, there are products already that cater to this need. But as I said, there's this education gap as to how to use those. So what we've done is kind of filling the pie with more apple, in a sense. So we're basing it on the social bond principles, the sustainability-linked bond principles, which are, of course, the globally most referenced frameworks for sustainable debt issuance. So what we've done is we provide illustrative examples of gender-related activities and targets that potential issuers can consider. So it's really helpful for arrangers, borrowers, underwriters, even external reviewers to be able to look at this and advise their clients, and also for the corporates themselves to look at it and say, well, hang on a second, I hadn't considered my supply chain in this manner. What is it I can do here or there, and how can I actually finance that using these bonds? So also for investors, this guide acts as a resource. So for those that are seeking to understand what really would such projects look like, what kind of strategies should they be looking at from the investee companies? And I think going outside of this ecosystem I just mentioned, there are other entities that also have immense influence. I mean, consider exchanges. Exchanges list 50,000 companies with a market cap of over 90 trillion. And in many jurisdictions, the exchange defines directly and indirectly what is expected from companies listed on those markets. So they're uniquely positioned to influence their home markets in a way that very few other actors can. And so recently, only last week, IFC and the SSE launched a guidance report on how exchanges can advance gender equality. And that report also is one that I highly recommend to be looked at, again, within the scope of all of this. It's shaped by real-world examples from stock, bond, and derivative exchanges around the world, and it includes an action plan and best practice examples detailing 4 key ways by which exchanges can also take this forward. And I'll end by saying that in parallel, I think from a policy perspective, there are also a range of tools that can directly or indirectly promote gender equality, many of which the panelists here can speak more to. But I want to say a lot is happening, particularly within the European Union, around promoting the take-up of sustainable finance, which of course then also benefits this gender agenda, as I call it, and the discussions and the demand on the investor side. So hopefully we're working on both ends towards the supply and, of course, the demand.
Thank you so much, Denise, and please do share the link to your guide. It's really excellent. And thank you for joining today, and feel free to leave when you have to go. Now, let's bring in Mamiko into the conversation from the OECD. And I like Denise's apple pie. If infrastructure is the apple, the pie, and gender the apple here. And now, in the context of you being responsible for sustainable infrastructure finance, what gender impacts are we working towards in sustainable infrastructure, and how are these ESG criteria built in and implemented? Yeah, from your experience, please, Mamiko.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, Ingrid, and it's a pleasure to speak with you all. So I just wanted to provide some of our perspectives in relation to the work we are developing at the moment, the G20 Infrastructure Working Group, which is different from the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, but it's sort of a body that works in tandem. And also, we have other OECD bodies that we're also providing this sort of analysis as well. So we're currently working on developing a report that examines the various sustainable finance as well as sustainable infrastructure guidance and standards that have been developed internationally, as well as some of the private, industry groups that are around. And they range from the Equator Principles, the Green Bond Principles, EU Taxonomy, as well as some that are very specific to infrastructure investment. The objective is to really map, to try to understand the areas of convergence, because there are so many at the moment. And so that we know from more general, because we know from the more general sustainable finance side, that having a guidance in and of itself doesn't really matter unless it's widely applied and also well-defined and in an accountable manner as well. So that's one aspect of our report. Another aspect that we're looking at the moment is to examine the availability of ESG data that is actually publicly available, and that's a key part of that examination. There are a number of initiatives that also look at, excuse me, this is on infrastructure specifically, not on finance more generally. There are some databases that are driven by memberships, so they're only available to membership. And so we've also looked at some of those as well, although they're not publicly available. So we are sort of looking at sustainable infrastructure, but that actually means ESG more specifically. So what it means is that when we're examining what constitutes ESG as applied to infrastructure investment, it obviously includes gender considerations. And at the moment, we're looking at 21 relevant sustainable finance and sustainable infrastructure guidances and standards. And of course, many of them are only focused on climate, but when we look at the 21, only 5 explicitly have a reference to gender. And the other aspect that is quite important is that even when gender is mentioned, it's not really well defined within those various standards. So I think we're trying to analyze 2 aspects. One is that gender is not well defined in most of the standards, and the second is that even when they are, the level of requirement is quite basic. So for example, when there is a mention of gender or women in one of these sustainable finance or infrastructure standards, they will ask a yes/no question around whether there's a gender action plan or whether it's been implemented. And the fear is that that will just result in a box ticking exercise. I think that might be not quite sufficient in terms of better understanding what exactly it means to have a gender action plan. So in terms of the ESG data, we have been looking at the financial databases that specialize in alternative financing because we're looking specifically at infrastructure. And so I think the conclusion is that it doesn't really exist. I mean, for example, there are some databases that, for example, have an ESG transparency indicator. And that is basically based on whether the funds, the alternative infrastructure funds, actually have ESG information disclosed. It's not actually specifically about what it means. So that means that the data for risk and impact level of ESG of infrastructure asset is simply not yet available. So given that gender is not highly covered in ESG data and for infrastructure, this means that in aggregate, there is little to no data that is available on gender issues in relation to infrastructure investment. And so we think that a lack of data means that the investors cannot be accountable for such issue. And I think that is quite a critical issue in terms of pushing the infrastructure investment as well as addressing gender issues at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamiko, for that important observation and gap in creating of the enabling environment for true ambition when it comes to gender. And now I would like to turn to you, Barbara. So from the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development, you are leading the work of the bank on economic inclusion across the bank's sectors and geographical locations. Now, what are you seeing? I don't know if you're able to speak to some of these gaps that Mamiko highlights and the challenges around data and the way that things are implemented, but also how you see the latest trends and approaches to overcoming barriers for full economic inclusion, which I believe is what we are all working towards, and what would be the business case for the bank to invest in this area?
Thank you very much, and I'm also very delighted to be here today in this very high-profile panel to talk about this very important aspect of the EBRD's work. Indeed, integrating gender into particularly our climate investments is one of our key strategic priorities in the years going forward. And we've just launched our new gender strategy that specifically looks at how to do that through our operations, but also our policy engagement, and of course in partnership with our many partners in our countries of operation and internationally. So we have heard a lot about the business case, why this is needed, some of the challenges, and certainly also from my point of view, I can say that I share the importance of a focus on data, on sex aggregated data, on collecting that data, on doing so in a systematic way, in a regular way, and then very importantly also actually using that data. It's one thing to have the data, and we're seeing quite a lot of movement in that context in various different ways across our countries of operation, but also internationally. The challenge we often see is then actually to take that data and to analyze it, to better understand where are the bottlenecks, where are the particular challenges in relation to operational business practices, but also in relation to policy challenges, and what kind of solutions, what evidence-based solutions are there that we could deploy in partnership with our clients, in partnership with our policy stakeholders. So I think it's about data, but it's also about the use of data. Another thing that we often hear is this sort of, you know, we want to focus on green. Climate change is one of the key challenges that this our globe, our society, our global society face, and gender equality is also important, but can we do both at the same time? Isn't there a trade-off? Isn't it more important to focus on one and then the other? And I think what we are seeing increasingly, and we've heard that also to some extent from previous speakers, is that you can't, you can't just hide in a way behind the trade-off. I think it's now very clear that we need to do both, because in order to really tackle climate change, we do need to involve women as viable economic, political, community actors, players, but also decision makers. So it is important that gender is fully integrated. At EBRD, we have seen a very practical and live example of how this is actually possible. As a bank, we have a target of investing 50% of all our investments into climate and green investments. And we have really scaled that up over the past years. But at the same time, we've also increased the share of our projects that have a gender component, a gender smart tag in our language. From 15% only in 2020 to over 35% in 2021, and we're looking to increase it even further. So what that really shows us is that combining a focus on gender and promoting gender equality and green investments is something that works, and something that our clients increasingly demand. And we've also heard that, you know, the demand is there. We just need to make it. We need to make it happen. So I think the important thing in a way for us to now to look at is, how do we actually make that happen? What are the specific activities that we can develop together with our clients across a range of different sectors? What is the practice there? You know, we've talked a lot today about the big sort of financial instruments, but if you look at on the ground, how does that actually work? What happens? And here again, I think it's about building capacity, looking at a broad range of sectors, building standards and systematic approaches. For this, we have been working together with other MDBs, notably the EIB and CDC, in order to develop a gender-smart climate finance guide that looks at 11 different sectors, very, very broad ranges, from pharma to infrastructure to agribusiness to manufacturing to financial services, and come up with toolkits and analysis and guidance of how to integrate a focus on gender into climate investments across those sectors. We launched that at the COP last year in Glasgow, and actually this year we wanted to showcase some of the first real-life examples of how this happens in practice. So I think that's one way to really try and scale up and learn the lessons from the various different backgrounds, but systematize the approach. The second one, of course, is policy engagement. So in a way to have the pincer movement, to look bottom up, what can we do working with women in businesses, as employees, at the corporate level, municipal level, but then also national level policies, opening up access to green skills, green jobs, removing labor market restrictions, for example, but also really looking at how investment climate reforms can open up opportunities, particularly for women-led businesses, as an example, to invest, to scale up and to grow. And then maybe my final point here is within an organization also, it is about integrating gender in a way that is not just a good to have and an add-on, but is actually part of the core business of what we do. So at EBRD, we have set ourselves a gender scorecard target where we want to have at least 40% of our investments to have a particular gender component. We have systematized what we mean by a gender component and introduced a gender smart tag, which is based on the OECD gender marker, and allows us to systematically look at every single one of our investments, undertake a gap analysis and the baseline, and then come up with specific actions that will actually be gender transformative in terms of the impact that we achieve, both in relation to our client, but then also more systemic across the sector and at a policy level. So there are many different examples that I could give from, how we integrate gender into our women in business programs, our green economy finance facilities and infrastructure investments, renewables investments, and so forth. Maybe I can do that when we come back at the second round.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Lots to learn from all the systems and mechanisms that you've put in place there, and encouraging to hear that there is a clear linkage for your investors and clients between the green and gender. I think that's very promising. Now, let's spend just some minutes now. We want to be a bit mindful of time for the next round of questions to the panelists. So if we could limit ourselves to like 2-3 minutes per speaker now moving forward, so that we also have some time to take questions from the audience at the end. I would like to return to you, Mamiko, and see whether you could highlight some examples from what you have seen within the OECD and infrastructure finance specifically, of where ambitious initiatives have had an impact on the ground, like Barbara also highlights the impact that we have on the ground. Please, Mamiko.
Yeah, I don't know if we can give you the impact that we have on the ground. I think we can only talk about some of the ambitions we have and some of the enabling factors we're hoping that can influence, because I think for us the key issue is sort of giving predictability and certainty to investors, and we think that can actually really contribute to sort of enabling much more, because what we know, and I think it's been echoed quite a lot when all the panelists, is that investors are quite willing to invest in sustainable finance, and I think this includes infrastructure areas. I think the issue is that there's a lot in infrastructure, there's a lot of bankable, they call it the lack of the bankable projects, and that comes from sort of a lack of understanding, a lack of certainty and data and methodology around it. So I think what we are trying to do with some of the sort of work that we're doing at the moment is actually try to develop sort of an assessment methodology for the various initiatives that converging. So we're not looking at a binary assessment, but we want to have a little bit more of a risk-based analysis. And I think this was key in a lot of the sustainable finance discussion as well. And I think you also mentioned the greenwashing aspect, which is basically that the methodology may not be actually as sufficiently robust as we think. And I think this is an area that still sort of bedevils sustainable finance. And I think it's also something that is becoming a lot more important for the infrastructure as an asset class as well. I just want to go over some of the figures and why infrastructure is sort of particularly important. So I think there was already mention of the SDG, and the Paris Climate Agreement is obviously one of the big areas. And so at the COP26, excuse me, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, they sort of put together 130 trillion US dollar capital to achieve net zero. And also we know that the US 100 billion has been sort of a pledge for developing countries in particular to make a climate transition. And looking at how this will be divvied up in terms of specific areas, it looks like infrastructure will be a bulk of it, because we're looking at transport, renewable energy products, and water treatment projects, which are important for the climate transition in particular. So we know that these are going to be made primarily by MDB financing, but also governments as well. And then this will be matched by private sector investment. And so in that context, the governments and MDBs, and we've already heard about from Barbara as well, is that they're increasingly looking at standards for ESG standards to be met. And this also includes gender as well. So when private investors look to invest, they have the opportunities, they want to have the appropriate labeling and assessment that is made so that they can closely consider all ESG standards that are being made appropriately. And this can be well extended to gender. It could have a very important impact, and we're eager to identify the method and approach which might enable this. So as I said, I think giving greater certainty and predictability so that investment decisions can be made, and having that around gender will be particularly important, and something that we hope that can be sort of actually led for greater gender sort of considerations when investors actually go into projects.
Great, and I think you touched upon a question that we have from Robert Rono in the audience. How do we bridge the gap on training and capacity on how to sing at the local and international levels? And here I think the knowledge gap that we are talking about is really to more clearly define the criteria for financing and making sure that the guidelines are known and available for people and organizations, groups and private sector actors that are seeking finance. I would like to turn to you, Nina, now, and have you share a bit more about the trends that you are seeing, and hopefully some upward trends in terms of ambition in the work that you are doing and the projects in terms of impact on the ground. Please, Nina. And if you could keep your reply to a couple of minutes, that would be great, so we can have some more questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, at SIF, although our primary mandate is to provide financing, but we see equally important is the knowledge generation, learning hub, and really sharing, kind of being a thought leader. And on that, there has been a lot of work that's been done on just transitions in the past few years by my colleagues. And in there, we really take an approach to really seeing both the social inclusion aspects, so ensuring that various groups that are traditionally marginalized from the policy-making processes, finding ways through the processes to bring them into the table, but then also ensuring the distributional impacts. And on that, one kind of more specifically on gender, we believe that gender equality is not possible without systemic change to enable women's participation in institutional processes. And the change can occur both in formal and informal settings, and through changes in norms, governance mechanisms, policies, systemic shifts through formal participation in public planning, budgeting, but also shifts in labor markets, employment, entry requirements, credit markets, and policy measures, etc. And therefore, we're developing kind of a systematic approach to it. And in the handouts here, I shared our vision for women climate leadership. This is an exciting initiative that we're starting now, looking forward, and especially applying it to the new programs that SIF has announced. We announced two at COP26 last November, the renewable energy integration and accelerated coal transitions, and we're about to announce a large program on nature solutions as well. So for them, we want to have this really systematic approach of what women climate leadership could look like. What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? We've partnered recently with the International Institute for Environment and Development for this work, and we're conducting a systematic dialogue-based process kind of participatory action research, where we will be first developing this conceptual framework for women climate leadership, but then applying it specifically to these new programs that are currently under development, using the process of investment plan preparation in the countries that have been identified as priority recipients of the funds, and seeing how this framework can be applied in this context and what can be done to address those barriers. So we really hope that we will be able to look at it comprehensively and come up with some very specific solutions. And another amazing initiative, Global Affairs Canada just announced last week their commitment to provide some grant funding for, they're providing a large portion of the loan financing for the accelerated coal transitions, but because of their commitment to gender, they're also giving us a substantial grant to complement that work. And we're calling the program Women-Led Coal Transitions. And we'll be working on setting up mechanisms to bring together women organizations at a regional or national level to really be part of the whole process of developing the transition, both in kind of policy making, but then also implementing it on the ground and working with the local level women groups, building their capacity and making them active participants, and using this grant mechanism to pilot various approaches to access to finance, to access to training, which could then be further scaled up through loan projects. So those are some practical examples of our ambitions. Thank you.
That is amazing, Nina. We will be coming to you for more on at a later date on particularly women-led coal transition, discovering and really exploring the gap on gender in just transition. I think your initiative there is very, very important. May I turn to you, Marcos, now to speak a little bit about, again, how do we catalyze and scale gender-responsive sustainable finance? I think we've heard a lot about now that the challenges are in the indicators, the metrics, the availability of data. There are many challenges. At the same time, there's a lot of hope, and we are seeing some upward trends, but still not quite at the level where we want to see it. So maybe you could share from your angle about investment incentives that governments may use to address gender equity, including, the various instruments that would be at the hands of governments for this. So Marcos, I'll hand it to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, because one thing that Nina said that we fully subscribe. In the end, this is a very systemic change, right? You're really gonna have to tackle gender equality through very, very different aspects, from the participatory, elections and so on and so forth. Let me give a few examples of kind of work that we're trying to do to scale things up. One has to do with the policy and has to do with the utilization of of two major instruments that governments have: budgets and taxation, right? So we are launching a new program, Tax for SDGs, which has a window on gender and taxation. So that's an important area. The other one on budget, we are doing a lot of work on helping governments. We did it in Mexico, we did it in Mongolia, helping governments look at the national budget and start by first tagging national budgets or subnational budgets, to the SDGs, to climate, and then starting to look at, Ministry of Finance issuing different set of notes based on the understanding of the budget, right, to align ministries to start driving policy. So, for example, we worked with Indonesia recently on a gender-responsive climate budget. It was astonishing to see how simply the tagging of the output transformed into the thematic state budgets of different ministries, right? So it kind of resurfaced those aspects. The second example of our work has to do with, I think it was Miko that mentioned about pipeline, right? So I think one of the things we've done is that a couple of years ago, we developed in Brazil a methodology that basically converts NDCs and SDG plans into investment opportunities, right? So we call these SDG investors maps. We actually launched an SDG investment platform, which now is covering 20 countries and has about 295 investment opportunity areas that have been identified. 59 directly on SDG 5. For example, in Kenya, the investor might identify a need for a mobile platform to establish links between smallholder farmers and markets, which would primarily drive female farmers' access to market. The estimated market size for this business model in Kenya, it's over $4.3 billion, with an indicative return of 20 to 25% and the lift up of millions of women farmers back into the marketplace. So we have a lot of those trying to identify sectors and subsectors which can then be taken on by the investor community, which is directly linking to the SDGs, to the NDCs, and to women in that aspect. And finally, for over a decade now, we have been supporting the implementation of what is called the Gender Equality Seal Certification for the private sector. So we work with national governments to certify the gender impacts of the business sector, giving clear market signal which companies not only committed to advance gender equality and women's empowerment, but they have been able to address and close the gender gaps in their business models, right? So this program has been implemented in over 20 countries, Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, and has certified more than 1,000 companies in a variety of ways and industries, including energy, telecom, tourism, and agri-industry, impacting more than 1.5 million workers. So those are a few things that we are concretely putting on the ground on top of the bonds and the policies in the G20s that is trying to get to that opportunity, that hope that you talked about it, you know, concretely, and really trying to scale things up inside the business models like the gender seal, you know, in the national budget, and bringing to investors sectors and subsectors that can become a pipeline around NDCs, climate, and women business as well.
Thank you so much, Marcos, for that. Also, another hopeful outlook and kind of really showing, I think, the potential to reach scale that is out there. So let's turn again to you, Barbara. And again, truly on the impact side of things, and economic inclusion really being at the heart of what we are trying to achieve. So in your experience, are there any game changers that you have seen in the area of economic inclusion at scale that I think Marcos is touching upon here? Maybe you could highlight a couple of examples that you have seen that could lead to or are already leading to really transformational efforts and impacts.
Thank you very much. So I think, as very often is the case, you know, you really need to go all the way into the details of investments, of what actually happens on the ground, of the policies that are being developed in order to achieve systemic impact, in order to really achieve also impact at scale and tackle those sometimes very knotty issues in relation to really pinpointing where the issues are and opening up opportunities. So to give you some examples, we have our green economy finance facilities that I mentioned earlier. And here, in a way, the aim is to support women entrepreneurs to access finance in order to invest in green technologies. And that, in a way, is a very straightforward thing to do. However, in order to really ensure a systemic change, we actually need to shift the market. So we need to show particularly finance institutions, banks, that women entrepreneurs are a viable market segment, that lending to them is not only the right thing to do, but it's actually the smart thing to do. So that the business case has to be established also in relation to climate finance. So this really is the heart of the program. So it's about looking at what are the characteristics of this market segment, what kind of products do women favor in this context? What is it? Relationship banking? Are they very price sensitive? And all these things, in a way, paint a picture of what is this market segment like, and how can we support our partner financial institutions to develop the products and services that actually target that specific market segment because it's a viable market segment and because it is an underserved market segment. So it's about making the business case, and by investing initially and providing some technical assistance for baseline analysis and product development and capacity building and training, we actually want to shift the market, and we want the market to refocus and then run by itself. So that in a way is the systemic side of things. And then at the policy level is to open up opportunities to remove some of the barriers that women face to set up their businesses, to grow their businesses, to access finance. So that in a way you look at both sides, the demand and the supply side, but crucially, I think for us in the middle, in a way that stands the partner financial institutions. So this is what we've been doing in Tajikistan, for example, where we have actually seen the share of female green loan clients increase from 28% in 2018 to over 14% last year. So that really is a huge shift that I think speaks to the viability of this model, actually looking at the market and the change of the market. Across other 8 countries, we have an average of almost 30% of female clients across our partner financial institutions. So this really is, I think, something that is huge and can really take up and can really increase systemic change. On the other side, of course, it's about new technologies, it's about new industries, it's about renewable sectors as a growing market. Access to green skills, green jobs, opening that up for women is something that I think is important if you really want to enable women to play an important role in shaping those industries as they are growing. So I've just come back from Egypt, where I was the week before last, and looking at the enormous opportunities that exist there in terms of renewables, wind and solar power energies, and also the need to, in a way, diversify away from gas and that important just transition process actually that needs to happen, and the importance to have women at the center of that, and in related investments really having a focus on promoting gender equality built into that, working with clients, with investors, with schools, universities, vocational education institutions, to link all these different actors together, but also the relevant ministries, Ministry for Energy, Ministry for Education, Ministry for Labour, to really come up with a joint plan of how to make this transition towards a greener economy also open for women and enabling women to participate in that. So maybe I leave it at that, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Barbara. Now we have another question from Reverend Godfrey Biamukama. Sorry if I'm not saying that name the way it should be said. It's someone who is involved in the Survivors Soul Foundation for Children's Initiative in Uganda, which I believe is a church-based and possibly, I believe, also a community-based initiative. The question is, when working with child protection and particularly focusing on vulnerability and poverty at grassroots level, at community level. Now, I don't know exactly who this question is for. It could be for either of the panelists. How could someone in such a project at community level facilitate transformative change through access to funding opportunities and sustainable finance in the way that we have been talking about that today? I don't know if I should be putting someone on the spot. I'll leave it to the panelists to see whether any of you would like to put your hand up and take a stab at that question. So linking sustainable finance with community initiatives. I can't see if anyone is putting their hand up. So perhaps should I put you on the spot first, Marcos, because you popped into my screen right now?
I would just say that, you know, when you are talking about reaching, you know, smaller communities, rural communities with finance, right? I think some of the stuff that Barbara and others were talking about, the kind of investors we're talking about, large ticket items, which sometimes are very difficult, right, for communities to bear that interest. And so I do think that what really has proven in the past, and I used to work at many years, decades ago, it's the whole aspect of, microfinance, visiting saving loans, banking, the bottom-up building of a financial system, right? Who then at some point, as it grows, meets up with the national banking system and eventually with the international financial system. But we have to have instruments that are adequate for the needs and the cultural aspects of communities.
Thank you, Marcos. I think that's the beginning of the answer to that question. It's complex, and thank you for bringing in, Marcos. I think the issue of scale and ticket size of investments, I think that has typically been one of the barriers that we haven't spoken too much about today. I don't know, Nina, whether you want to add anything to that response to that particular question?
Yes, Ingrid, thank you so much. Well, I wanted to elaborate on the experience with the direct grant mechanism that CIF had. And it is indeed one of our most proudest kind of mechanisms, because exactly does provide those really small grants, but the decision making and the design of them is taken directly by the indigenous groups, and among them there is a very high percentage of women. However, as Marcus was mentioning, there are limitations of that mechanism, and one testament of that only among our 6 MDBs, only World Bank is using it because the size is so small, and the transaction costs related to really running something like this are quite substantial. And this is where, in our new initiative under ACT, with this funding for women-led coal transitions, we're trying to link that up a little bit more to also policy making. So we have this idea where we will have a national mechanism, and we'll work with women organizations at national or regional level to come together, the type of organizations that would be able to participate in more kind of policy discussions. And even for that, they might need specific training. They need to be kind of brought up to speed to be really partners at that policy making tables. But then to have them work with those local led and kind of work on the community mobilization on the local level, and make sure that the funding is not only used for really small grants to address specific needs of women in those communities that will be affected by coal transitions, but also to be testing various mechanisms that then can be scaled up through the sectoral transformation. So I think it is very important to be considering the transactional costs, but also the linkages between kind of small community level interventions, but how they can be affecting systemic change. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nina, and thank you again, Godfrey, for the great question, bringing in that community perspective. Very important. Now, I would like to go around the table now with the panelists and give everybody an opportunity to perhaps try to conclude. It's difficult to conclude such a rich conversation, but if we could take just a minute per panelist now to highlight just the one or two things that we should now do from here to bring this gender responsive finance to scale and towards the mainstream of our financial systems. Of course, that's a huge question to respond to in a minute, but just based on what we've been talking about today, if you could have a last word on this, should we start with you, Mamiko?
Yeah, sure. I don't really have a lot to add in the end, but I think it's been fascinating to sort of understand that the gender perspective for each of us is quite different. And I think that adds a lot of rich sort of contextualization to what exactly we're trying to address in the financial system. And also, I think a lot of different asset classes were also covered. And I think because I actually work on a very specific asset class, it's actually really interesting to sort of try to understand what other areas are trying to be sort of pursued in what way. I think one of the things that really came up and sort of really resonated with me was actually the capacity building piece, because when we talk to a lot of the, especially in Africa in particular, when we're talking about some of the financing aspect for infrastructure, I think it comes out repeatedly that the project preparation phase has been key to ensure that investment can be attracted. And I think that actually sort of also adds to the area of sort of just making sure that there's technical assistance and capacity that's being made available. And I think it's a really wide-ranging issue, but I think this also would actually enrich a lot of the gender sort of consideration that all the sort of people that are developing projects can also put into, when they are actually developing the projects as well.
Thank you, Mamiko. And again, that response that is also speaks to the question we've had previously on the capacity building aspect. So thank you for highlighting that. Now, I would like to go to Barbara, then Nina, and then Marco, just to give a sense of the sequencing. So Barbara, if you want to highlight your key takeaways from this conversation.
So thank you very much. I think from my side, the important thing is to look at different levels of impact and different actions that are required to achieve that impact at those levels. So one of the overriding areas really is the point that was made on data, understanding how we achieve impact, what are the indicators, how can we harmonize those indicators, how can we really across the piece understand what we're actually achieving through our investments, be that sort of bonds or be that sort of individual investments almost to clients. The second area then is policy action. What are evidence-based policy solutions that actually work? Then it's all about capacity building toolkits, and then finally, I think importantly, the practical action on the ground, working with companies across a broad range of different sectors to really implement the activities that we know actually work.
Great, thank you, Barbara. We have a comment, it's actually a question, but I want to turn it into a comment because I think Koboyega Olorunfemi actually answers the question quite nicely. So it's highlighting the fact that there seems to be quite a low number of women that are active in this space, not in this panel, but in this space. And that's based on experience going to a UNFCCC Gender Action Plan workshop previously. And the suggestion here is whether it would be good to make scholarships available to university students and the younger generation. And I think that's an excellent suggestion. I want to just bring that into the conversation as well. So thank you very much for that comment, and not least focus on bringing in the voices of the younger generation. So thank you for that. Now, Nina, over to you and your key takeaways.
Thank you, Ingold. Well, there have been a lot of important points already emphasized, but just to elaborate on the last one that you made, for me, one issue that did sound very strongly in a number of messages in what Mamiko was saying, but also earlier Denise and Barbara, is the importance of dialogue. How even in our own organizations, the people who work on finance and people who work on energy and people who work on gender are different and don't talk to each other, haven't talked historically, are starting to talk, but there is still quite a lot of dialogue that needs to be happening, and then dialogue across different organizations, and on the country level also this, private and public sector, national and local women organizations finding their ways into those conversations, and with recognition that some of them might not necessarily have the necessary expertise and speak that language properly, so would need to be both the climate policy making, but also the finance language, and would need capacity building to gain that proper seat at the table. So ideas like scholarships, but also various forums and platforms that bring together those different stakeholders at different levels, and then also strengthening their collaboration of those actors on the national level across different countries, bringing them together and creating opportunities for networking. I think that's a very important specific answer how it could be done. Thank you.
Excellent summary there. Thank you very much, Nina. Over to you, Marcos.
Well, I think a fascinating part of this conversation is how much every one of us see the system in a very similar way and is contributing complementary aspects to move the entire system, right? From policy to instruments to capacity and so on and so forth. And I think that for me tells that nobody has a solution to those things alone, and partnerships are very important. And taking, I might be calling most of you later on to figure out what we can do together. And I think the last thing is, I don't know if it was Barbara or Nina who mentioned, but I do think that we still need constructed a common narrative that from different parts of our work, we are providing similar messages that you cannot solve climate change and poverty, accomplish the SDGs with only half of the world's population. We need 100% of the world's population. It is the right thing to do. It's actually good business, and it needs to happen. So I think maintaining this narrative and hammering this narrative from whatever angle, from the human rights to the business to the return to whatever, right, is essential. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Marcos, and also again for highlighting the importance of partnership. And I think that's what we are doing today, is also what we are trying to foster also in this mentioned gender expert group at the GDKP platform, which Nina is also a part of, which we are very grateful for. So yes, thank you. I think we've come now towards the end of the panel discussion. I will not try to conclude, because I think the conversation has just been incredibly rich from all the panelists, and also the comments and questions that we've had from the audience. I think we have covered the entire value chain from design and tinkering around with data and the rigor that we need in establishing criteria for finance to actually flow. It might sound technical, but it's an essential part of that finance mobilization, and making sure that we do that all the way through the cycle, that it doesn't end up just being a tick the box exercise at entry when projects are being designed and submitted for financing, but that they are actually leading to rigorous measurement of actual results. And of course, those results should come to the benefit of communities and people on the ground and move us closer towards closing the gaps in sustainable development and SDGs and NDC implementation and all of that. I really like also the focus we've had today on the issue of capacity building. I think stemming from the fact that we need more rigorous systems in place within financial institutions and in the design of our financial instruments and the financial system. I think the capacity building aspect and closing the gaps in understanding is what will also lead to financial access of communities, of private sector entities to these financial resources that, according to Marcos, are in abundance. They are just floating around looking for the bankable projects and initiatives that will lead to impact at scale. I also think we have highlighted a lot the role of government policy, smart policies, that really is key to moving this from the margins of our economic activities towards the center where it belongs, in order to face all the challenges that we have as human beings in this moment of time. So I think that is a call for further partnership and further discussion down the line and following this webinar. Again, I want to extend a great thanks to the wonderful panelists. Thank you for sharing all your expertise and experience, and to the audience as well. And I thank, on behalf of myself and the Gender Expert Group and GGGI, for the opportunity to moderate. And I would now like to give the floor to Stephanie Vidorini, who is manager of the GGKP Green Forum, who will remind us of a few opportunities for further engagement on the topic of today's webinar. So Stephanie, please, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ingvild and esteemed panelists, for such insightful reflections. It is really clear that there is still so much work to do in this space, and the clock is ticking. Sincere gratitude on the efforts of our esteemed colleagues. Today's discussion pushed the needle in favor of urgent, impactful, and collaborative actions on gender-responsive sustainable finance. So to keep the momentum going, our discussion will continue in the sustainable finance and gender group discussions on the Green Forum. Why is it such a critical moment for us to foster collaborative action? Well, as the movement for inclusive green economy continues to grow and we enter the final decade of action on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the importance and value of engagement and exchange among the growing number of partner institutions, experts, practitioners, and community as a whole is more important than ever. So sign up today at thegreenforum.org, and we encourage you all to share a quote or questions from today's discussion if you haven't got a chance to do so. Thank you again to our panelists for generously sharing their time on such rich discussions. And to those of you in attendance, thank you for joining from wherever you may be. As a reminder, today's event was the second webinar in the Aligning Finance Policies webinar series. For more info on this project, go to ggkp.org/aligning-finance-policies. You can also have our latest news sent straight to your inbox. Subscribe to updates from the GGKP Green Finance platform at ggkp.org/subscribe. We look forward to welcoming you all at another Green Finance platform event soon. Thank you and goodbye.